Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Growth and Beyond. Today, I'm chatting with Ryan Buick, sweet name, the co-founder of Canvas, which is a Sequoia-backed San Francisco startup reimagining the traditional office suite for a data-driven world. Pretty epic. During our chat, we touch on what it really means to be data-driven, because you hear that term a lot these days, how to bridge the gap between data, marketing, and sales teams, which is a super big problem within organizations. And we also cover the impact that AI is having on the data industry as a whole, and we cover a lot more than just those things. But with that being said, let's get to it. Here's my conversation with the co-founder of Canvas, Ryan Buick. Please enjoy. All right. What's up, Ryan? How you doing? Thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, Jacob, thanks for having me, man. Excited to chat.
Yeah. Likewise. If you don't mind, could you say what's up to the audience and share something that you believe to be the biggest myth when it comes to growing a business?
Yeah. So, hey, everyone. I'm Ryan. I'm one of the founders of Canvas. I think one myth is that you have to automate and scale as fast as possible. That everything has to be, go, when in fact, the less you try to automate, the less you try to scale, the more human that you try to be, the more authentic that you try to be, the more personal that you try to be in all of your, reach outs and all of your partnerships and all of your customer conversations, I think has been a lot more successful for us. And it's been a lesson in sort of slow growth, which I think is the sort of strategy that we have.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. One of my really good friends, he had this saying that stuck with me. It's slow is steady and steady is fast. I'm like, damn, that's when you actually sit and think about that, you're like, wow, yeah, that's pretty powerful and very true.
And it's hard to get like psyched up every day to go and do this and be rah. It's like the much more approachable way is to think about it as like farming, and it's just like you're trying to get something done, just something, make one sort of progression a day, whether it be growing customers, whether it be on building, whether it be on you name it. If you approach it from that, it's I think a lot more sustainable.
Do you mind walking us through your journey to becoming a co-founder of Canvas and how you got started in your industry specifically?
Yeah, for sure. So I've been a product manager by trade, worked for a couple of different startups in Silicon Valley. Most recently, I was at a company called Flexport. If your audience might know it, Flexport is essentially the sort of the leader in digitizing freight and world trade. Think of it as like if you're a consumer goods company, if you make shoes and you need to get your shoes from your factories in China and Asia into your distribution centers at your warehouse in the United States or Europe, typically this is all done in email and paper and CSVs, and it's really complicated, and shipments, you don't know why they're being delayed. You don't know why a trucker is charging you hundreds of dollars per hour because he's sitting waiting at the port. And so what Flexport does is try to digitize this incredibly complex relay race of trade from pickup all the way to destination. And so, the product that I worked on there was essentially the aim was to be kayak for freight. So we worked on essentially quoting and, booking and invoices. So giving customers, the logistics manager at, say, Allbirds, the ability to say, I want to ship this many shoes on this date from this port to this port, and give them a series of quotes and options that made sense. And then they could just automatically book it and just watch the shipment go across the world and get notifications that help them optimize their trade. So the product that I worked on there, we had to collect vast amounts of CSV data from ocean carriers, from airlines, from truckers, customs brokerages. And so we needed a way to basically centralize that information and make it accessible when you're looking at 10,000 rows of SKU data and all hundreds of columns of port pairings and buy costs and transfer prices and final sales prices. It's just an insane amount of data to try to put into a sort of traditional web app or a web UI. And so what we did is actually just built essentially a spreadsheet-like interface to all of these data sources and allowed our teams to go and analyze that data without necessarily needing to be technical or know how to know SQL. And so that was working pretty well for us. My co-founders and I, we had met there, we're on the same team and decided to go build a more horizontal version of that product. And so really we left a couple of months into COVID, went out and raised a seed round. And really what we're doing now is we help early stage teams, non-technical teams, and frankly, engineering teams centralize their data from their SaaS tools and from their database and give them a way to analyze it without needing to know SQL. And so think of it as like a spreadsheet interface on top of all of your data so that you can combine product data with sales data. You can build dashboards, you can answer ad hoc questions instead of the traditional route, which is, hey, I need to pull some data. I'm going to go export it from 3 different tools and then wrestle in Sheets. And then the next time that I have to do it, I have to go do it all over again because it's offline. We really give you a way to do that over real-time data from all of your sources.
I know this question, you could probably answer it for 24 hours straight, but what does it mean to be data driven? Because I feel like that is a term that a lot of companies use, even though they're not. And then why is that important?
It's definitely become a cliche and almost like a meme in the data space.
Mm-hmm.
I think what it really means, and there's so many different flavors of it, but are you being objective? There's so many decisions that you have to make in a day as a startup. A lot of them you can skate by operating off of your gut. But there comes, either for certain, high leverage decisions or for certain areas, like if you're a product manager, if you're operating from your gut and you're not being data driven, that's probably a problem, right? And so I think what it means to strip away all the BS and marketing lingo is like, are you looking at the truth before you go decide to do something? Like, do you understand what the data looks like? Like, are you able to build metrics and do you know your numbers? Are you planning projects? Are you planning features around not just launching it and saying, hey, we did it, let's move on to the next one, but are you celebrating the incremental changes that you're seeing on XYZ metric, right? After you shipped the feature or after you completed the project. I think that's ultimately what it means to be data-driven, is that you're not looking at necessarily the output, but you're looking at the outcomes of what you're doing.
Why do you think it's important to be data-driven? Well, you may have touched on that, but
yeah, I mean, I think why it's important is like it reduces the margin for error. It gets everybody aligned on like, okay, what is the state of the world today? And what do we want the state of the world to be? And then you can just measure it more objectively. And there's a lot of work that goes into that, right? And so that's why, a lot of times we want to operate off of our gut, but you're going to run into problems and you're going to look bad if you do something and you didn't know how to measure it, or if you have to go back and then ask for resources to do the next project and the next feature, and you're not able to point to tangible success or tangible failure, which is just as important.
right.
I think that's why it's really important to be data driven, and I think why it's hard is that there's a lot of work involved to do that, and so we try to make it easier for folks.
And speaking to that point, it sounds like Canvas sort of alleviates the necessity or the need to work in tandem or as closely as historically it's been with like data analysts. Is there anything, or can you explain to the audience the struggles of working with a data analyst? Like if there's anything traditionally that you've seen problems coming up around?
Yeah, I'll start with sort of what is the status quo of what data teams do, or why data teams are hired to do that. And then I'll talk about why it's a little difficult for everyone involved. So the status quo today is, you're a Series A, Series B company, you're collecting data across a bunch of different SaaS tools, you have your own database data, you're, probably operating a lot off of your gut. You're close to the customers, you're close to the problem. There's not a lot of complexity there, but there becomes a time when like you need to actually start. You need to go raise your next round. You need to have metrics that you're, moving the entire company against. You need to understand your sales performance, your financial health, your product funnels, your drop-offs, right? And so the status quo today is you either go out and get a data team. And so you hire your first, sort of data analyst or data engineer. And I'll explain what those do. Or you get a data consultant. And then you have to say, okay, we need to centralize all of our data. And that's typically what a data warehouse is for. So like if you've heard the term like Snowflake or like BigQuery, data warehouses are essentially a central repository for all of your data. So you then use a extract and load tool. It's called ETL or ELT, called like Fivetran is like the big player in this space. There's a few others, and they build connectors that connect your SaaS tool data or your databases to that warehouse. And so it's constantly refreshing, every 15 minutes or what have you, into the data warehouse. And then once you have it in a data warehouse, you can then start to centralize that data. You can start to build metrics. You can ask questions of it. And typically how that's done is through like a business intelligence tool, or you're writing SQL on top of your data warehouse. A lot of that is really complicated and not really a core competency for a lot of early stage, engineering teams or product teams. And so that's why they lean to saying, okay, let's hire a data person. But there's a lot of friction involved there. You have to spend months recruiting. You have to, go and buy a bunch of tools that you're not familiar with. You have to, do a lot of these things. And so that's really what we help with is, hey, let's give you a one-stop shop to centralize data from your tools. We give you a data warehouse, right? We connect all of your sources, and then we give you a visualization layer to use your spreadsheet skills or use SQL to interact with that data. Why it's hard is that a data analyst or a data engineer, basically the difference, those are like the two primary roles. A data scientist is sort of another term for a data analyst who's working on more like machine learning, AI, things like that. But really what's tough is that they have to go and take a lot of raw data and transform it to make it meaningful. And so what does that mean? That means that, if you've ever pulled raw data from Salesforce or raw data from Stripe, you've seen how messy it is. There's a ton of columns. There's a ton of things that like you can somewhat recognize, but it's really hard to build metrics off of that. And so what they're doing is taking that data and basically making it usable. So making it into a table that's combining a couple of different things to say, hey, here's a table that we can actually now use. It's, I've verified there's no test data in it. The, strings are cleaned up. You're not seeing like weird characters. And so now you can have that data and start to make metrics on top of it. And so that's a lot of work for a data team to do. And they need a ton of context from the business side. And so they're really trying to say, okay, come in and consult with like the business teams, the engineering teams, and say, okay, what is the data? What are the things that you want from this data? And how do I need to shape it and craft it to be that? So I'm kind of dragging on here, but the problem that exists is that, you have a tool where you can access this data, but it's often really hard to work with the data. And so you have business teams basically making, reporting requests to data teams who are like, wait, what are you asking for? Like, we're not speaking the same language. And so that gets frustrating for all parties involved. You have, data pipelines can break, you have a bunch of things that you're trying to maintain. And so there's this constant sort of tension between business teams and the data teams that ultimately you have to just constantly work on by saying, okay, let's partner really close together. Let's make the data usable. Let's understand where you're going. What new features are you adding so I can account for it in the data? And it's something that just needs to be, really tended to. But if you have a system that makes it easier to, centralize and analyze and work on, make it easier to clean up that data and transform it, then, you have a higher probability of people being more independent in their analysis and being able to access it more self-serve.
Yeah, totally. It seems almost, because I have a lot of experience with the struggle between data teams and marketing teams and sales teams, etc. Like there's like this push and pull, but it sounds like from what you're saying, like it's almost like an organic problem that no one can really help. without a tool like Canvas in the middle of it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, you can't solve the problems of like, hey, we need to, you know, you still at the end of the day need to understand your data. You still need to like do the work to make it more usable. But if you have systems in place where people can at least get their hands on it and start to ask questions rather than, hey, I have a question and I'm just going to put it into a Slack channel to a data person. Like, I want to see XYZ. And they're like, what are you talking about? Like, what does XYZ mean? If you can give them a way to sort of get 80% of the way there with their own analysis and then say, hey, I have some questions on this specific field or on this specific chart, right? Then you can actually break down those barriers and make it easier for these teams to communicate together. And so that's a big part of what we do too, which is allowing business users to get 80% of the way there, leave a comment to the data team right where the data lives and say, okay, data team can now inspect whatever work you've done in like your spreadsheet interface, open it up via SQL, make some changes, explain what they did, and get you to the answer faster. And so it's really a team sport at the end of the day.
Yeah, very cool. And this is sort of like a wild card question, sort of selfishly centered, but is Canvas different than what people are calling a customer data platform or a CDP like Segment?
Yeah, good question. So that's sort of another part of like the data stack that I alluded to earlier with like the warehouse and the transformation, like the ELT tool and the BI tool. This is like Segment, collects events, collects, users, identifies things like that. That's really all of like your front end, data in your application, right? Or you can use it to store different inputs. And so I think of that as like really first party like data collection that ultimately also gets sent to the warehouse. So it's treated like another source, even though it's like a much larger source of data, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so what Canvas is, it's like essentially the last mile of this is the front end to all of that data, whether it be from Segment, whether it be from Stripe, whether it be from Postgres, HubSpot, you name it.
So how did you guys go about approaching the initial stages of building and growing Canvas? And what were some of the biggest challenges that you guys faced?
Yeah, I think from initially, our mission has always just been to make data easier for everyone, right? There's obviously it's a big mission and there's lots to that, but I think what we started out with saying is, okay, let's build an interface that the majority of people in a company can access and use. And I think you run into a lot of the problems that we alluded to earlier with data quality. And so we, really wanted to make it easier for the data team or the engineering team to help them with some of that data quality and some of the transformations and things that needed to happen. And so we did a lot of work up there, a lot of work up front there to basically make that easier. I think another problem is like this is just such a large surface area to build that like you can't really go after a very like specific vertical, or like you can't go after like a very specific role to start with, because you're going to have multiple people that are wanting to access different forms of data. And so how do you build a horizontal platform? It takes time, right? You can't just like quickly say we're going to be this go-to tool for this role. Because pretty soon they start to want other, data sources. They want to start other use cases. They invite someone else to the team in Canvas, right? And so it sort of starts to spider out from there. So I think that was a big first challenge, is just like making sure that the product is usable and can account for a lot of different use cases, but it's also different, right? There's a lot of tools in the data space, and so how do you stand out through that noise? And I think what we found is picking a particular wedge, not in the form of a role, but really in a type of company that we think that we're most suitable for. Because this, concept of a data stack is, well known to like Series C and later companies, Series B maybe in later companies, but it's a bit of a sledgehammer of a solution for what most early stage companies need, which is, hey, I just want to put together some charts pretty quickly without having to like buy 4 different tools and like hire a person to do that, right?
Is there like a particularly challenging moment in the history of the company, and how did you overcome that if there was? I'm sure there was. There always is, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think it's I think the particular challenge is like trying to be different, right? Like what I just mentioned, like you can know that your product is really useful, but and people like using it, but like are they willing to pay for it, right? And you have to sort of
Right.
cross that penny gap, right? David Sachs, I think, talks about this, but like
Hmm.
you can have a product that people love but aren't willing to pay for it when there's a lot of free tools or open source tools or things like that. And so you have to really keep digging and digging to find like where is the actual pain that you're going to pay for. um, and so I think that took us a decent amount of time to get to. um, and during that, right, like there's you're working night and day, and you're all striving towards something, and you're not getting a ton of wins or satisfaction, and it can be tough and easy to give up and start blaming each other. And that's why it's really important to have like a great team around you, right, of people that are going to be in the trenches and willing to grind to ultimately get to something that matters and something that is different.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like so you built and then looked for customers. Like in retrospect, would you have approached that differently, or would you have done it the same way? If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it's a it's a really good question. I think I think at the end of the day, we knew that we were gonna like we weren't trying to build a small feature of another tool, right? Like we knew that we wanted to build a pretty large game changing, platform rather than just like a feature of a former BI tool or like a former data tool, right? And like make that better. So I think if you know what you are going into it, then you can easier, I think, more easily set expectations with yourself and with others. Like we knew this was going to be a long ride, and it still is going to be a long ride. But yeah, I think if you're trying to do something that's really different, you also have to vertically integrate it, and you have to make it something that has a wedge against the current incumbents who might just be doing one thing really well.
And speaking of your first customers, how did you guys go about acquiring them?
Yeah, I think like everyone else, right? It's you have to I think you have to just be comfortable with the right level of embarrassment.
Right.
um, and sort of put yourself out there and see, because if you're not talking to customers, then you can end up just building a toy or something that doesn't really solve a problem, or more importantly have something that people are willing to pay for to solve the problem. So we did a ton of customer research early on, like interviewed hundreds of people across all these different roles. And we had a lot of friends in our network, right, from companies that we had all worked at. And I think we had the advantage of like this problem is pretty pervasive. Like I don't know if you got it. You're like as a marketing team trying to speak to a data team
Yeah.
on hey, we need this, right? It's something that I don't think any business person has ever not exported data out of a tool, exported data out of another tool, and then tried to like index match them to get to an answer.
Right. Yeah.
um, so we had the benefit of that being pretty tangible, and yeah, really just kept refining it, building a early stage version of the products. Like you don't want to overinvest in making it pretty or making it polished. I think you just have to focus on like getting to that first customer that's going to. And so a lot of that comes from friends, comes from your network, but it also just comes from sheer grit and like you know trying to get a couple pilots, trying to get somebody who believes in you. And I think when you find it is like this person is like obsessed with the problem and obsessed with solving it, and they're willing to wait, right? But hey, if you give us 3 months, we'll build what we think can solve this problem. Like, are you down to set up a Slack channel and work with us and just give us feedback when we release stuff. And so I think that's a big part of it. And I think what I alluded to earlier with like slow growth is like, if you go and try and like spend a bunch of money on ads and like, just drive strangers to your tool, like that's not going to, maybe it's not going to work for everyone, but it definitely didn't work for us, right? Because you need to have that some sort of connection or some sort of relationship that you can work off of to make it really feel like a partnership. For your first couple dozen customers, it's more likely a partnership than it is if they think of you as another vendor, you're going to lose to other vendors that are bigger and they have more features and it's an easier sell to their boss, right? Like
Right.
we can't be wrong if there's hundreds of other companies using this. And so that's why you need to really find like those special early adopter types who are like going to go to war for you.
Yeah, and sort of shifting gears a little bit. How do you think the rise of technology and data has impacted the way that companies approach marketing and advertising specifically?
Has affected how companies market themselves or
Yeah. Well, or what else were you gonna suggest? I'm good on either probably.
yeah, maybe could you ask it in a different way? I just want to clarify real quick.
So like given the AI like recent, I don't know what you call it, success like
Yeah.
of the masses or whatever, attention. How do you think the rise of that sort of technology and data in general has impacted how companies approach, and I'll open it up to not only marketing and advertising, but data in general. You know what I mean? Because I feel like we're just as I hate to say like humanity get too big, but like there have
Existential
been
book writing.
yeah. So apologies for anyone that is sick of hearing about this, but like I feel like there's just so much at our disposal. It's hard to focus on the right things at the right time. And I just wanted to get your opinion on like what you think this level of technology and the things that we have at our disposal are doing to the data industry specifically, or marketing and advertising.
I, there's a bunch of different ways that I could take this. I think like to maybe walk through like a little bit of what's happened like over the past like 20 years, right? It was originally you had essentially these like scribes of people that knew how to access a database, and everyone in the company basically relied on them. And there wasn't enough data. There's hardly APIs, right, of connecting different systems. And then you started to have, this concept of a data warehouse where storing data became really cheap and really fast. And then you had APIs that were connecting all these different tools together, and then it became easier to have a centralized source of truth and a couple people that could access that information. And you start to have some UIs on top of it for other folks, and you're sending data to other tools. And I think like we're now in a different boat where there's too much data, where you don't necessarily know what to make of it. And so now you have this problem with like more and more people can access it, but can they really understand it? Can they use it to do things that they want to do? And so I think that's really the next, evolution of this, which is like, sure, you could spin up, chat GPT as like a base for querying your data. But like, if you've ever tried, like we're playing around with this, like integrating with it, and there's a lot of meaning to the data that needs to be ironed out before you can actually just say, give me how mmany customers we have, like, well, what's a customer? Like, what's, are they active? Are they, there's 21 questions that you can ask about any sort of object in that semantic sentence that you've just spelled out. And so I think that's the big problem that we're now challenging, which is, okay, how do you take billions of, data points and actually smooth them out and make them more usable? And that's really been the curse of like, and why self-serve analytics is kind of like a joke, right? Or like a meme within the data communities, because it's like, okay, you're going to give someone who like doesn't know where the bodies are buried the ability to go and make a metric that's totally wrong, right? And so that's why our thesis is like, okay, let's actually work on making the data more usable. We give you templates, right? We give you these things that out of the box, a normal data engineer would have to produce for you. Let's give you a better starting point to the data and make it more useful for you. And then let's also give you a way to communicate and collaborate with your teams so that you can iron out those edges of those questions of what is a customer, right? Because you might have a totally different notion in your head as a marketer of what a product qualified lead is, to an engineer, right? And that's the frustration that you spoke about earlier, which is like, how does a marketing team communicate something to a data person or to an engineer? For the past 10 years, it's been, okay, give me a paragraph of what you're trying to look for, and then I'm going to go give you a simple query that I think matches. And when I give it back, there's going to be like, oh wait, but I need this, this, and that. And then it's just this really frustrating back and forth. And so what we're trying to do is get everybody on the same level playing field and use their different context corners to actually get to that answer in a much less frustrating way, I think, for everyone involved. Like what was the example of like, the conversation that you would have, like just as as an exercise, like you as a growth asking a data person?
Yeah, I mean, I would be grilled with the questions like, why does this matter? And it's like, I just spent a week getting the approval from my boss. Now I have to tell you again, you know what I mean? Like that was the frustration. It was like I had 6 battles to fight, and 3 of them just selfishly didn't feel like I needed to fight them. You know what I mean? But in retrospect, it's like crazy because the data team are the gatekeepers. Why don't you just have a conversation with them first? Back when I was having these conversations, I was really honestly the liaison between the data team and the marketing team, and that was sort of my superpower in the organization. And I found that position was so vital to the success of almost every campaign, because if you don't have a good way of communicating to the data team or them respecting you like on a human level, you just don't get anything done, because it really boils down to just basic like personal relationship. You know what I mean? Because it does become so subjective at a certain point.
And this was a huge frustration that we had, which is like, you're like bribing a data analyst. Like, what type of whiskey do you like? To help you out with some big project, because there's a lot of there's a lot of misconceptions, I think, from the business side of like, what is this data person doing all day? Like, why can't you just answer my question really quickly? And then if you walk a mile in their shoes and see, okay, I understand your question, but I have to go now and show you what I'm having to do in this data to get to an answer. They're often battling just as an uphill against how the engineers have built the products and how the data is stored and the gaps in where you're collecting, right? If something is hard coded on the front end in the product, like that's going to make your job near impossible to actually get that data. And so it's this big sort of a assembly line of like people thinking that something is easier than it actually is. And that's, goes into prioritization. It goes into these lead times. It goes into, okay, I give up my, I throw my hands up as a business person. I'm just going to go into Sheets and try to see if I can do this myself. And so our thesis is, okay, let's make it a little bit easier for the data team to actually give them a head start on modeling the data. And then let's give the business person a way to get at least 80% of the way there with their question, and then come with a more dialed in question of specifics to ultimately, try to help everyone just move faster. Because you're right, at the end of the day, it is super messy, but how can we make it, less messy?
Can you discuss any ways that Canvas is staying ahead of the curve and remaining competitive in this crazy, rapidly changing software landscape?
Yeah, I think one of the things and we're still pretty new, so we should be ahead of the curve on some things. But I think one of the things that's happening in the data landscape in particular is that there's been this I mean, obviously with, where the VC market was, a year or 2 years ago, there's this massive influx of new data tools that are essentially doing, very specific things. And you now start to have, data teams that are buying, a dozen tools to do, their jobs. And I think it's a natural like unbundling of where we were in the like 2010s, where you had like an all-in-one tool, which, was limited in some ways, but it was easy to procure and buy, and it was less, complicated to string everything together. And I think what we're trying to do is actually go back to that a little bit and say, hey, you could either be drowning in complexity and have to hire someone to go get all these tools for you for a problem that doesn't exist probably for most early stage startups, or you could go with Canvas and get essentially a one-stop shop and be able to do the things that you need to do. and we'll help you with a mix of services. And, we think of ourselves as a fractional data team that's going to help you solve problems, and really try to simplify it for you. And I think there's always this sort of unbundling and bundling that happens in every industry, but I think it's happening. The unbundling, I think, is sort of overcorrected for data at the moment, and you're seeing a lot of frustration and a lot of I think frustration is just a word from buyers who are just like, really, do I have to go and hire a small army of people and a large arsenal of tools just to build some charts? Like, that seems extreme.
Is there like one thing that you found that you can recommend to fellow founders on, just maybe it's like a characteristic or an attribute to just improve their likelihood of a successful business?
Yeah, I think learning how to sell and getting comfortable with selling is something, like, because most founders, right, are coming from a product background or coming from an engineering background, and they've never really had to sell anything before. And I think it's an incredibly
this will be the
important
magic of
skill,
editing.
Not only just for fundraising, but building out your first,
it'll be like the fastest
you're ready to
recommendation.
hire someone. Like, you can't outsource
holy shit, he was ready for that one.
Product. You can't outsource marketing your product in the early days, because if you can't do it, how can you expect someone else to do it? Right? Anyway. You know everything about the product. You know everything about the problem. That's your job.
Maybe I'll change the question to like,
there's an art and a lot of,
and before I ask it for real,
you can learn about how to sell.
Here's the question I'll fire off. Are there is there like
that is
one thing that a founder can do to just improve the likelihood of success?
It's an early stage go-to-market handbook. It's by a guy named Peter. Cool. I always butcher his last name. Peter Kaczynski.
I hate using different voices. It's so funny.
Peter K.
I'm going to try not
Peter
to
K.
do that.
We'll call him. Put it in the show notes. But it's like an incredibly like no BS guide to like how to think about your initial deck, how to think about outreach, how to think about pricing, how to think about just everything that you need to do in the early days as a founder. And I think it's just like mandatory for all of your founders to be selling. Everyone in the company should be selling in the early days. And so if you get comfortable with it, and it's really uncomfortable asking somebody for money and then shutting up, but it's something that you absolutely have to do.
Oh yeah, couldn't agree more. That's a really good one. Well, cool, man. Where can people learn more about Canvas or more about you?
Yeah, for sure. So our site is canvasapp.com. You can follow us on Twitter. It's @Canvas, which is a lot easier. And I would love to chat with you on LinkedIn or Twitter. My name's Ryan Buick. It's Buick, like the car. And even if you have just looking for data advice or, whatnot, would love to see how we can help. And
Awesome. Well, really appreciate you, Ryan, for coming on the show. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what you guys can do over there at Canvas.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jacob.
No problem. Thank you. Thanks again for listening to another episode of Growth and Beyond. I hope you take something you learned from the conversation and apply it to your business today. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review wherever you're listening or watching and share it with a friend. And please be sure to tune into next week's episode where I interview another top business leader and highlight ways to achieve growth for your business. See you then. If you'd like to level up your customer base and let us help you grow, visit testandlearnagency.com.